A ďalší príspevok sa bude venovať prístupu Európskej únie k obetiam terorizmu. Svoje skúsenosti nám predstaví Aleksandra Ivanković z organizácie Victim Support Europe, ktorá sídli v Bruseli. Týmto ju pozývam k sebe na pódium. Alexandra, the floor is yours. You may start now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, sorry to break your break. My name is Aleksandra Ivanković. I'm Deputy Director of Victim Support Europe. And before I start talking about radicalization, victimization, and the vicious circle, let me just tell you quickly about the organization I come from. Victim Support Europe is an international NGO. We're a network of victim support and victims' rights professionals. We bring together more than 80 organizations primarily from Europe, but also from all over the world. And since 1919, we have been working on advancing rights of all victims of all crimes. However, since 2016, we have started more and more developing expertise on the rights and needs of victims of terrorism and mass victimization because we realized that no one else in the EU was doing that at the EU level in terms of trying to find common approaches, collect best practices, and build standards for the provision of support to victims of terrorism and mass victimization. And why is it important to talk about victims of radicalization and terrorism as the ultimate manifestation of radicalization? Okay, so we have already heard some previous speakers talking about adverse childhood experiences, and what is really important to understand is that adverse childhood experiences actually bring us into this vicious cycle of like victimization in childhood. So children can suffer physical abuse, emotional abuse, they can suffer neglect or all sorts of dysfunctionalities in families, and then as such they become vulnerable to get radicalized. But what is important to understand is that adverse childhood experiences create a situation in which a child can be groomed, brought into all kinds of abusive situations. So radicalization, it's just a matter of inverted commas luck, whether a vulnerable person will be groomed by a terrorist group, whether they will be radicalized for some sort of like religious group, whether they will become a victim of human trafficking, whether will be groomed into drug trafficking cartels. So it's a matter of bad luck. But the same environment, the same vulnerabilities are creating the ground, fertile ground for grooming for these kinds of nefarious purposes. So it's really important to not just talk about radicalization, about vulnerability for radicalization, because it comes from the same background. So once that happens, once a child or a young adult usually who is vulnerable and comes from this kind of background of disadvantage in early childhood, then they can be groomed and radicalized in this context. Then they will be exploited, then they will commit crimes, and then they will create the second generation and generational trauma, and this is where we enter into this vicious circle. So this is why it's really, really important to break it and to intervene with support as soon as possible so that we can prevent further repetition of the same scenario. So that's really, really important to understand, and this is what we have been working in Victim Support Europe to understand and to find tools to resolve. Okay, so with this in mind, it's really important to think about who can be a victim. So we heard during the previous presentations, we heard some colleagues talking about victim of radicalization. Those are people who have been radicalized and now need support to come out of that kind of mindset, to be brought back into the society. And this is where we break the circle. But they are not the victims in the sense of Victim Support Europe. Victim Support Europe starts from the definition of victim that's been set in the Victims' Rights Directive, and that talks about direct victims. So this is the definition of the Victims' Rights Directive. Direct victims, a natural person who has suffered harm, including physical, mental, and emotional harm or economic loss, which was directly caused by a criminal offense, and family members of a person whose death was directly caused by a criminal offense. So those are victims according to the Victims' Rights Directive. But then we are trying to understand the definition of victim from a broader perspective. So victims' loved ones will be affected by the crime, maybe not directly, but they will be watching their loved one suffering, and they will want to support their loved one, so they can be indirectly victimized. And then we also talk about, in particular, first responders, and there was a mention of first responders in previous sessions, bystanders and community members. And why is it important to talk about first responders? Because first responders are exposed to crime and trauma in an indirect way, and very often they are actually excluded from the legal definition of victim because it's their job. And that can be very, very risky, and that can cause long-term trauma. And let me not talk about that myself. Let me show you the man himself. Oh, can someone play the video? Because I'm not sure I can. So, sound.
That's how long it took for FDNY, for NYPD, for Port Authority, for EMS to respond to an urgent need from the public. 5 seconds. Hundreds died in an instant. Thousands more poured in to continue to fight for their brothers and sisters. The breathing problem started almost immediately. And they were told they weren't sick, they were crazy. And then, as the illnesses got worse and things became more apparent, well, okay, you're sick, but it's not from the pile. And then when the science became irrefutable, okay, it's the pile. But this is a New York issue. I don't know if we have the money. And I'm sorry if I sound angry and undiplomatic, but I'm angry, and you should be too, and they're all angry as well, and they have every justification to be that way.
So this is just a small excerpt. I hope you recognize the guy, Jon Stewart, late night host and a comedian, and also a big advocate for the rights of first responders of 9/11 attacks, who weren't recognized as victims and who were actually fighting for their right to health care in the US for many, many years before they were actually granted health care. So it's really important to make sure that we remember that first responders can also be victims, and that it's not anyone's job to actually suffer lifelong trauma without support if they're doing the job that they do. So with this little introduction, I'm just going to go quickly through how we at Victim Support Europe think around needs of victims, and I will make a particular reflection on victims of terrorism. So we understand that all victims of all crimes have 5 basic needs: respect and recognition, support that includes information, protection that includes protection from secondary victimization, access to justice, and compensation and restoration. So those are 5 basic needs that every victim of every crime has, and we have to build our national victim response systems and victim support frameworks, understanding that there are these 5 basic needs that even a victim of a bicycle theft will have, just in a different way and in a different scope than a victim of terrorism. Then we need to understand that needs of victims might diverge depending on the type of crime, type of victim, and circumstances of the crime. And all of this is defined in the EU Victims' Rights Directive, which is enforced in Slovakia as well, you'll be surprised. And then last but not least, we find an individual response based on the individual needs and personal circumstances of victims. So how it looks in way of thinking and a way of responding is to start by setting up systems that are able to capture and respond to all of these 5 needs for all victims, and then build it up to get to the individual needs assessment, which is also an obligation according to Article 22 of the Victims' Rights Directive. Now, we develop response to needs of victims of terrorism here in this middle layer. And we need to think about not just victims of terrorism as such, but terrorism and mass victimization, or maybe also like radicalized violence. Why? Because if I tell you that there has been a year ago an attack in Germany, in Magdeburg, where a radicalized individual has driven his car into a group of people who he didn't like, you would think that it's terrorism. I will tell you it's not, because German police treats it as a traffic incident. So you can, see writings in the papers, etc., that there has been a terrorist incident in Magdeburg, but according to German legislation, there wasn't. So that means that if you have a formal response that's only focusing on victims of terrorism, unless there is a label by the law enforcement, by the political actors, whatever is the procedure to put a label on an incident as a terrorist incident, those people will not get that support. And very often there will be a very generous compensation to victims of terrorism. And if you're not a victim of terrorism, you don't get compensation. And many other rights, including rights from the EU Counterterrorism Directive. So it's really important to talk about terrorism and mass victimization in the same breath and organize the response in line with that. And I will talk about specific needs of, or like specificities or organizing response to needs of victims of terrorism and mass victimization. It is really, really important to work on prevention. And this is what we have been talking about today. But then when prevention fails, and every now and again it does, this is when we get victims. So it's really important to not stop at prevention, but also to continue after prevention has failed, after the crime has happened and after we have victims. So this is preparation and planning. It's very, very important to prepare and plan not just your emergency services about, like healthcare professionals, investigators to go and collect evidence, first responders, firefighters, whatever. It's really, really important to have victim support included in preparation and planning. Because you need to start responding to the needs of victims from the very first impact of terror attack. You can't think about responding to the needs of victims after something has happened. You have to plan that ahead. So what we have, for example, in France, in many other countries, but in France in particular, in France they have an NGO network called France Victimes. They're the federation of 130 smaller NGOs who are a network and who are part of national crisis preparedness and planning. And when there's a mass incident, whether it's terrorism attack, whether it's a train going off rails or a tsunami, they are part of the national crisis response because they know that there will be victims and they're thinking about responding to the needs of victims from the very first second of the impact. So France Victimes are the ones, for example, who will set up a crisis helpline for people affected by a disaster. So this is really important. Second thing is crisis intervention. So obviously you plan, you work on planning. You can have, for example, tabletop exercises. You can have drill exercises where you involve victim support professionals as well. And then when the crisis happens, you have a crisis response that can be easily launched and that can respond to needs of victims. You need to have a victims register, for example. When you have a crisis situation, you have no idea who your victims are. I just showed you that there's circles of victimization. So, for example, after a terror attack in Nice at the Bastille, 14th of July 2018, the French authorities defined a perimeter around the tracks of the truck that hit and killed many people, 192, and then injured many others. And they said whoever was within this perimeter will be considered a victim. And then, depending on the impact of this terror attack, we will define what their rights are, how much compensation they will get, etc. So it's really important to have a register of victims and to have a way to follow them up, to identify them as soon as possible, and then to follow up to make sure that after crisis intervention, we do transition to long-term support. Because victims of terrorism, victims of trauma, of mass violence, suffer not just in a week of your crisis response, they suffer their entire life. So you need to have a way to contact those people, for example, for anniversaries. Because you will potentially, if there is a terror attack, and I was just walking up the castle here in Bratislava the other day, and I saw this memorial for two victims of hate crime. The plaque said that they were victims of terrorism, but I don't know if officially they actually were, right? Was there a determination of this hate crime as a terrorist attack? I would assume not. Yes, it was defined as terrorism. Okay. Okay, so then the plaque was giving correct information. Thank you for confirming that. But then I saw that there was this spontaneous memorial, that there were candles, that there were like some small items, gifts, arts. I don't know if there was an official discussion, if there was any sort of official commemoration, what will happen with those candles and those things that have been put there on the street. So these are the sort of things that we need to think about in the long term. Now, like 2, 3, 4 years later, this is the long term and we need to think about it. Have the family members of these people who lost their lives been involved in the organization of this commemoration, or has that been spontaneously done by someone? Have the authorities reached out? We have, for example, in Belgium, after terror attacks in Brussels in 2016, and then when the first commemoration was being organized, they forgot to invite foreign victims. They only invited the Belgian victims because Belgian authorities only had the list of Belgian victims, and in the preparation and obviously the busy times of preparation, they haven't done it deliberately, but they have forgotten to invite foreign victims. Organizing trials. I could tell you stories of hours and days about how complicated it was to organize trials for Brussels attacks, for Bataclan, for the Nice attack, so like thousands of victims, many nationalities. These are all things that we have to think about and think through. So one thing about trials, for example, and engaging with the media, who are usually interested in this, and I just looked in the mirror during the break and I realized one thing that they came up with in France for trials, because hundreds of victims are coming, there's media, there's journalists, they're all interested in reporting. So how do you know which victim wants to talk with the media and who doesn't? And like who wants to have their picture published on the main news that evening or not? And you have to respect victims' need for privacy, victims' need to maybe say something. They came up with lanyards that were either red or green. And if it's green, journalists are okay to approach you and ask you for a statement and take your picture. And if it's red, you might suffer consequences because the judge would be able to impose a fine or even to jail you if you publish an image or approach as a journalist a victim with a red lanyard. So there are some interesting small things that can be done in terms of also thinking around long-term support, which is not just psychological support, but it can also be legal, it can be practical, it can be medical, it can be many, many different things. So this is why we need to understand what are the individual needs of a victim before we can decide what the response will be. So I have 1 minute, 45 seconds. How do we do this? There is something that we call at Victim Support Europe National Victim Support Framework, which is based on the victim and on their 5 needs. And then when that framework is put into action, it looks something like this. So it's not, and I was telling your colleagues from Ministry of Justice who unfortunately had to leave, so missed the most exciting part of the day, we are not a McDonald's franchise. So we will not come to you with like conditions like this is where you buy meat and this is how your potatoes have to be and this is how your wrappings have to be. We come to a country, we talk to people, and we first understand, A, what the needs of your country are, because we saw, like, you know, in former communist socialist countries, there's very little terrorism. And then you go to France, you go to the UK, there is a higher threat. So this is why maybe in Slovakia, and I know for many countries from the former Eastern European bloc, they don't have a response to terrorism. And they should, for victims of terrorism. And they should. They work on anti-radicalization, on prevention. But I'm sure that you have victims apart from these few victims of the like homegrown terrorism. There must be cross-border victims of terrorism, people who were in Paris for that concert, people who were in Brussels in the metro station. Do you know about them? Do you know what they need? Do you follow up with them? So this is why it's really important to understand and develop responses. It's important to involve a range of actors. So we talk about victim support services. You have to have a support system that is able to capture all victims of all crimes in some way. I was talking to your colleagues from Ministry of Interior. The 116006 Victims Helpline will be an obligation in Slovakia very soon. So this is the first step where all victims can call to ask for support. There have to be specialist services. I was talking about specialist services for victims of terrorism. There are services for victims of domestic violence, gender-based violence, etc. But we need to work with everyone else, with healthcare, with education, with banking services, with insurances. We need to talk, of course, with justice and law enforcement, with judges, with prosecutors, with police officers. I cannot tell you how many times I heard from victims that the police interview was worse than rape itself. So we need to stop that. We need to have the police who are able to empathize with the victims and who are able to effectively communicate with them. And we need to have that with the prosecution. We have that with the courts, with educators, teachers, healthcare professionals. So how to do better? We are running an international response network for terrorism, where we proactively reach out to countries that are affected by terrorism to try to provide our advice and our expertise. We have been running EU Center of Expertise for Victims of Terrorism since 2020. That was an EU Commission project that has been discontinued this September, but we, as Victim Support Europe, will continue operating Center of Excellence for Victims of Terrorism and Mass Victimization as of January 2026. We have and we will continue involving victims and civil society in response. We heard about the fragmented and project-based response to radicalization. Same thing with victim support. Victim support is not a project. It's an ongoing, continuing societal service that has to be properly budgeted, properly resourced, and properly supported to be part and the core of this victim support network. So that's been all. Thank you very much. I've been taking a little bit more time than I was given, but I hope you won't mind. And if you need to get in touch with me, that's my email address. Please do. And I hope that this is only the first time that I'm meeting you all and that we'll continue these discussions in the future.
Thank you, Aleksandra, for even touching topics that we will go on further and discuss further during our debate at the end. Ďakujeme veľmi pekne a pokračujeme.